Ladies and gentle people, today we have an interesting show. We have on Dr. Kirk MacGregor. Dr. MacGregor is a scholar. He's actually written on quite a few topics, so I'd love to have him back later to talk about some other ones. But today we're talking about Molinism. So Dr. Kirk MacGregor has literally written the book on Molina, Luis de Molina. We have his book here. I would definitely suggest this book. This book has a lot of information in it, a lot of reference material, and I'm really enjoyed this book. Also, I have another book by Dr. MacGregor, Calvinism and Middle Knowledge. This book has so many contributors in it. It's just like the list is just like John Lang, Greg Welty, William Lane Craig, Paul Hamm, Kenneth Keithley, Kirk MacGregor, obviously, Bruce Ware. I mean, it's quite an impressive book. I'm very surprised you got all of you guys together in one place. So thanks so much for being here. And how are you today, Mr. MacGregor?
I'm doing very well. Thank you.
Great. Thanks for coming on. People out there will know that I think that it's so charitable for scholars to basically donate their time to people like me who just want to get the ideas out there and help people to understand first what the ideas are and what they entail or how they relate to other ideas, I guess you could say. So today we're going to talk about Molinism, but that entails that we're going to also be talking about the other views like Calvinism, Arminianism, open theism, maybe Thomism, things like this. So with that being said, let's get right into it. So Dr. MacGregor, tell us about yourself first. Who are you? How did you get interested? First, before we talk about your academic career, let's first talk about your formative years. How'd you get interested in the Bible, theological studies, philosophy, all the things that you've been working in?
I think I may have lost a couple of seconds. I think the question was, how did I get interested in everything that I was working in?
Yeah, sorry. I wanted to talk about your formative years before your academic career. That's the question. Yeah. Is, how did you get interested in these things?
Well, ever since I was 5 years old, I've been very interested in the Bible. I remember going to Sunday school and getting this, what was called a little white Bible that contained memory verses from every book of the Bible. And I had that memorized as a 5-year-old. I have always loved studying scripture. I've had a special fascination with the Gospel of John. I recently wrote a book on the Gospel of John, published last year. I was raised in a Church of the Brethren background. That's an Anabaptist and Pietist denomination. And the Church of the Brethren never really deals with questions like sovereign individual predestination, or the types of questions that oftentimes occupy the Calvinist Arminian debates. I took it for granted growing up that God knew everything that could happen, would happen, will happen, and that human beings had genuine free choice. And I never thought to believe that there was any contradiction or any tension between those until I started my undergraduate studies and I saw this longstanding debate between Calvinism and Arminianism. And I wasn't convinced by either the Calvinist perspective or the Arminian perspective. And on philosophical grounds, I was not convinced of the open theist perspective because I deny the grounding objection on multiple different fronts. And I finally encountered the views of Molina rather in a roundabout way. It wasn't until I was a master's student at Biola University that I heard a lecture by William Lane Craig on on Molinism vis-a-vis open theism. And I thought to myself, I want to read what Molina wrote, because it sounds like Molina may have discovered something quite profound. And I bought the book 4 of Molina's Concordia, which is currently the only book of the 7 in the Concordia that's been translated into English. It's called On Divine Foreknowledge, was translated by Alfred Freddoso. And I read that from cover to cover and just absorbed it. I was learning Latin at the time because that was a prerequisite for graduate work. And when I got sufficient skill in Latin, I decided to tackle the Concordia in full. So the Concordia in full, just to show it to you, looks like this. It's a very thick book. It's 7 volumes long. It's Latin. And so I decided to see what all he has to say in that book. And it's interesting that only the portion on foreknowledge has come into English translation, but the full title of the Concordia, Liberi Arbitrii cum gratiae donis divini praesentia providentia predestinatione et reprobatione concordia, which means the compatibility of free will with the gifts of grace, divine foreknowledge, providence, predestination, and reprobation. And so Molina treats that in all 7 books, and I became convinced that even though Molina was a Jesuit, which obviously I'm not, I don't belong to the Roman Catholic tradition, but I was convinced that Molina's reconciliation of precisely those items he listed was in fact correct. And I began writing on issues on Molinism, starting in around 2006. I started working on a book which would be published a year later called A Molinist Anabaptist Systematic Theology. So that came out in 2007. And then you've already mentioned the 2 other works that I have published on Molinism. I've also written a lot of scholarly articles on the topic as well. And just something that I'm working on now, I've got a new volume in the works, which is provisionally titled Molinist Philosophical and Theological Ventures. So I'm under contract to write that, and hopefully that book will be out by 2023.
Wow. Okay. I'm definitely interested in that. I wanted to get your book on Anabaptists as well, because I'm actually was not familiar, but that kind of leads us into your academic career. I know you went to Biola. I know that you studied under, you were a student of Dr. William Lane Craig's, and one of the things that we often hear is that Molinism is so popular because Craig's popular. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, and then maybe we'll talk about Molinism from Molina's perspective as opposed to what you might call a more modern day philosophical perspective.
Yeah, I do think it's extremely helpful and really very close to Molina to use the tools of contemporary analytic philosophy to understand Molina. I think where there can be confusion is when people assume that what Craig does with Molinism is what Molina himself did with his theory. And in some cases, Molina didn't do those things. So when I was at Biola and heard Craig speak on Molinism, that drove me to the sources themselves. And so my primary knowledge of Molinism came from Molina first and foremost. And then only secondarily did I read the various literature that was out there. Alvin Plantingo was really the first person who brought Molinism back into the philosophical conversation in a little book titled God, Freedom, and Evil in 1974. He's such a brilliant thinker. He accidentally rediscovered some of the key insights of Molinism without even trying. And he didn't realize it until after the book was written, and readers of the book pointed that out to him. So Molina then sort of came into the forefront. Craig wrote on it and brought to it a great deal of popularity. Craig has done quite a bit with the Molinistic theory, but Molina himself would not have been an Arminian. There are differences between Molina and Arminius that I think are too large to be bridged. And I think that one reason I wrote the book on Molina that you talked about, the biography, is to really get at the figure of Luis de Molina and to talk about what he did with his own theology. To give a good example, Molina believed in sovereign individual predestination. And I don't think that an Arminian would want to hold to that.
Right.
Molina and Calvin read Romans 9 the same way, but they differed on sort of the philosophical background, what's going on behind the scenes of Romans 9.
Very interesting. Yeah. So that's you made a lot of points there that surprised me. You know, when I first heard you talk about Molina's, even before I had read any of the book, when I first heard you talk about Molina's Concordia, and as you mentioned earlier, it only book 4 has been translated into English still till today. And so
Yes.
out of the 7 volumes, and I found that to be so incredible because I'm like, all of these other works have been translated. Why not this one? And then I believe I heard you talking about how difficult Molina's writing style was because he has all these like subclauses that he puts to kind of, I guess, clarify what he's trying to get at. And that can be a blessing because it's clear, but it can also be a curse because it may be difficult to translate, right? And then the second thing was when you started talking about, when I first heard you talk about Alvin Plantingo kind of unintentionally rediscovering middle knowledge or Molinism. And he was, and I guess still is, a Calvinist. And he kind of said, like, why can't I be a Calvinist and a Molinist? Right?
That's precisely correct. Yes.
And is he still till today? Because I wasn't.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Do you want to say anything more about the Concordia or about Plantinga? Kind of, because it's interesting. Sometimes I kind of think that I discovered something when I'm just logically thinking through something, and then I look it up and I'm like, this couldn't be the case because he's already the guy 1,500 years ago talked about this, right? Like Aristotle or something.
Right.
So, do you want to say anything more about those two topics before we move on?
I think we should go ahead and move on.
Okay. Who is, well, first, before we get on to Molina, what is Molinism?
Well, my description of Molinism would be a position that holds to 4 things. The first thing is that counterfactuals of indeterminacy, I'll define that in a minute. Counterfactuals of indeterminacy are true logically prior to God's creative decision. So that's one thing that Molinism holds. And a counterfactual of indeterminacy would be something like this. If creaturely individual essence, which has the property of libertarian freedom, let's call it a CLE, creaturely libertarian essence. If CLE were actualized in some exhaustively described set of circumstances, C, then the instantiation of the CLE would do A, or alternatively would not do A. And so Molinism states that those propositions are true logically prior to God's creative decision. Secondly, Molinism states that God, as an omniscient being, knows the truth values of these counterfactuals of indeterminacy logically prior to God's creative decision. Third, Molinism holds that God sovereignly chooses to create humans made in his image who possess, intrinsically prior to the fall and since the fall by virtue of prevenient grace, libertarian free will. Libertarian free will can be understood as a creature's ability in various circumstances to choose between the alternatives, to do A or not to do A. And then Molinism holds forth that God sovereignly chooses to use his knowledge of these counterfactuals of indeterminacy in providentially ordering the world. Molina was able to simplify all of this with a heuristic device explaining the various logical moments of divine omniscience. Now, a logical moment refers to a step in an explanatory series. It's not the same thing as a timeless moment or a temporal moment. So there's no moment in either time or eternity where God lacked any knowledge. So the first of these steps would be natural knowledge. Natural knowledge is God's knowledge of all logically necessary truths. That would be statements whose truth values are logically necessary. So logical truths, mathematical truths,
bachelors are unmarried.
Something like that. Yes, that's correct. So if God has this knowledge of logical truths, mathematical truths, and all possibilities include what the instantiation of every CLE could do in any conceivable set of circumstances. And if you think about putting together all logically possible conjunctions of these together, that yields knowledge of all possible worlds. Possible world doesn't mean like an alternative universe. A possible world is a complete and logically consistent description of the way some created reality could be. The second moment is called God's middle knowledge, and this would be God's knowledge of truths whose existence is logically necessary, but whose truth values are not. And this would include counterfactual or subjunctive conditional statements. And thus, God knows what the instantiation of every CLE would do in any conceivable set of circumstances. And if you logically put all possible conjunctions of those together, that yields knowledge of all feasible worlds. Feasible world being a complete and logically consistent description of the way some created reality would be. Third is God's divine creative decision. Sometimes it is used in the literature, divine creative decree. And what I found since publishing my book on Molina is that when people hear decree, they think something deterministic. And that is not at all what Molina means. People are taking Calvin's use of the term decree and sort of importing that over to Molinism. So it's better to say, for the sake of understanding, God's divine creative decision, in which God sovereignly chooses to create a feasible world containing humans with libertarian free will. Now, if God wanted to, God could have created a feasible world containing humans without libertarian free will, where everything is determined by God. It's just that Molina doesn't believe that God did that. And then finally, fourth is free knowledge, and that's God's complete knowledge of the actual world he has chosen to create. So past, present, and future. So that's Molinism in a nutshell.
Okay, so I like to take what somebody gives me and then just condense it. So what I'm going to say is something like this. Molinism is the view that God has three modes of knowledge. And that the first mode is going to be anything possible, God would know it. So possibility. Is that correct?
That would be some of what God knows in natural knowledge, but not everything. Yes.
Right, sure. And then the second part would be the would counterfactuals, or you might say here subjunctive conditionals, because
yes.
Counterfactual might be on the will part or something. But,
right.
But so we're going to say God knows what the first moment of God's knowledge is. He knows what could possibly occur. The second is going to be what would occur with free creatures, what they would choose. And then the third is going to be when he decides this is the world I'm creating, he knows then what will happen. Is there anything to clarify there before we move on?
Yeah, I would say that God's knowledge of what will be, which is part of God's free knowledge, is based on God's creative decision. The reason why free knowledge is so called is because it's based on God's free decision of which world to create. Or if you want to get more technical, God's decision of, I want to create these people in these circumstances and these people in these circumstances and ... and all of these people and circumstances fit together. They're compossible, as philosophers would say. And therefore, that on the basis of God's decision, God has this knowledge.
Gotcha. Okay. So before we move on, I want to just tell me if this analogy is apt. Okay. My wife does not like mint chocolate ice cream at all. She actually hates it, but she likes chocolate ice cream, right? So middle knowledge, God is going to know if she is in an ice cream parlor, what she could choose, mint chocolate or chocolate. Say those are the only two options, let's just say. So possibly those are the only two possible. She can't choose strawberry because it's not there, right? And then he knows what she would choose, what she prefers is going to be the chocolate over the mint chocolate.
Yeah, were she in those circumstances, right?
Were she in those circumstances, right? And then when he decides to put her in the ice cream shop, he now knows what she, not now in temporal sense, but logically, what she will choose.
Right.
And so with that example, why don't you give us a brief distinction between logical moments and temporal moments?
Yeah, well, I was trying to do that when I said that a logical moment is a step in an explanatory series.
Oh, so, gotcha. Okay.
To illustrate what I mean there, I'll give a real life example. I think that next month, my family, my wife, my son, and myself will be going down to Austin, Texas. I live in Kansas, to visit my in-laws and other people on my wife's side of the family. And I'm the one who does the driving on such trips. I'm driving down I-135, driving down I-35. The speed limit is 75 miles per hour. And I know I'm coming upon the Oklahoma state border. And I know that the speed limit in Oklahoma is 70 miles per hour. But I don't want to go 70 miles per hour. I want to just keep going 75. And so when I hit the Oklahoma state line, three things happen. One, I'm in Oklahoma. Two, I am subject to Oklahoma speed laws. And three, I'm speeding. So temporally or chronologically, there's not a single instant where one of those is true and the other two are false or are not yet true. And even if the fourth dimension of the universe were to collapse, the dimension of time, so that there were no time, there would not even be a timeless instant at which one of those were true and one of the other of them would be false or fail to be true. It's rather just that in terms of how you would explain it to someone else, what occurs on the basis of what. So my being in Oklahoma is the explanation or the reason why I'm subject to Oklahoma speed laws and not the other way around. And my being subject to Oklahoma speed laws is the explanation or the reason why I am speeding, not the other way around.
Right.
So you can say there are three logical moments. One, I'm in Oklahoma. Two, I'm subject to the speed laws. Three, I'm speeding. Even though in either time or eternity, there's not an instant at which only one of those is true or at which there's a progress in them.
Right, and so you have to be in Oklahoma before you can be speeding in Oklahoma, or breaking their speed limit, or something like that.
Logically speaking, yes. Right, right.
Okay, great. So that should clarify. I want to say that it seems like there are four major views of theology when it comes to this topic of God's foreknowledge and human freedom: Calvinism, Arminianism, Molinism, and open theism. And you might say that Thomism is kind of a it almost acts like a Molinist type system. Is that right, or am I misunderstanding that?
Well, I'm not really sure that Thomism acts as a Molinistic system. Certainly the Molinists in the 16th century and the 17th, or the Thomists in the 16th and 17th centuries didn't think so.
Oh, no, I'm sorry. I may have. What I meant by that is not that Thomists are like Molinists, but rather what I meant by that is that of the major systems, Molinism has like a vast scope. It can be adopted by multiple frameworks. Like you can be a Calvinist Molinist, you can be an Arminian Molinist. What I meant by that was that Thomism seems to be like that.
I would agree.
Okay, that's what I meant. Not that Thomism and Molinism are like branches of the same tree or something. Yeah. Is that's right?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. So I guess you could say that's one of the benefits of the Molinist view, or maybe it's just a good entailment of it, that it does have this, I don't want to say pliability, but this broad scope.
Yes.
Do you want to say anything about that before we move on?
Well, I would say that what kind of a Molinist you are, it really depends on what you're going to do with the Molinist system. So the Molinist system really doesn't describe anything more or less than what I've articulated so far. And therefore, you can use it as a tool in order to make better sense of Calvinism or to make better sense of Arminianism. I'm not sure how you can use it to make better sense of open theism, because open theism is an anti-Molinist perspective by its nature. So,
yeah. I've heard William Hasker say that he's an anti-Molinist, but he has some other like good things to say about Molinism, which is odd, but it's based on compared to the other systems, right? And so I just want to say that this, before we move on, for the Christians listening, this would be an example of adiaphora, right? Like differences amongst brothers. That means that this is not a salvation issue, that if you don't believe in Molinism or Calvinism or whatever, you're not saved. But rather, this is a difference amongst brothers and sisters in the Lord. And so with that being said, we're looking at the puzzle, okay? And there is this, we have these pieces like freedom, omniscience, which we'll get to these things, right? And divine decree or decision, whatever. And you think that Molinism, as well as I do, think that Molinism fits better as, I guess, a way to adhere all the pieces, right?
yes.
And so, do you want to say anything else about why Molinism is, I guess, your preferred view, your preferred method of making sense about the Bible?
Yeah. Well, I would say, first of all, why it makes sense of the Bible and why it makes sense of reality that I can know exists just purely through philosophy. So, concerning Scripture seems clearly to me to teach human libertarian freedom. And I think the classic proof text of that would be in Deuteronomy chapter 30, verses 11 to 20. So to read the relevant portion, Moses is talking to the children of Israel going into the promised land. And he tells them, obey the Lord your God and keep his commands and decrees that are written in this book of the law, and turn to the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul. Now, what I am commanding you today is not too difficult for you or beyond your reach. So it seems to me a plain reading of that would negate the doctrine of total inability. That the doctrine of total inability would say that after the fall, humanity in general does not have the faculty to do anything spiritually good, such as obeying God, keeping his commands and decrees, turning to God with all your heart and with all your soul. But here, Moses says that this command is not too difficult for them or beyond their reach. So he's saying, yes, you have this ability. Now, I'll get into why I think human beings now have this ability. I believe it's the case because of prevenient grace, but more on that in just a second. Moses stresses this by saying it's not up in heaven, so that you have to ask who will ascend into heaven to get it and proclaim it to us so we may obey it. Nor is it beyond the sea, so that you have to ask who will cross the sea to get it and proclaim it to us so we may obey it. No, the word is very near you. It is in your mouth and in your heart, so you may obey it. See, I set before you today life and prosperity, death and destruction. For I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, and to keep his commands, decrees, and laws. Then you will live and increase, and the Lord your God will bless you in the land you are entering to possess. But if your heart turns away and you are not obedient, and if you are drawn away to bow down to other gods and worship them, I declare to you this day that you will certainly be destroyed. You will not live long in the land you are crossing the Jordan to enter and possess. This day I call the heavens and the earth as witnesses against you that I have set before you life and death, blessings and curses. Now choose life so that you and your children may live, and that you may love the Lord your God, listen to his voice, and hold fast to him. So that seems to me pretty clear that it's saying that these Israelites, and we know by their later actions in the book of Joshua that not all of them were regenerate. We know that all of them had the ability, it was not too difficult for them, to choose to love God with all their heart or to not love God with all their heart. Similarly, I would think about the passage in 1 Corinthians where Paul is talking about temptation, and he says, no temptation has seized you except what is common to human beings, but God is faithful, who will supply the way out whenever you are tempted. And so the plain reading of that text says that when a believer is tempted, the believer has the freedom to either succumb to the temptation or not, and that God has provided precisely the way out so that they might not succumb to that temptation. I would also say that there are many passages of Scripture that teach that God does have counterfactual knowledge. Now, in light of what I just said about libertarian free will, then this must be counterfactuals of indeterminacy rather than counterfactuals of determinacy. So Matthew 11, 20 to 24 is a good illustration, where Jesus is talking about various cities and where his miracles had been performed. And he's saying that if he were to perform his miracles in other cities than those in which they had been performed, then the response would have been significantly different. So Jesus says in Matthew 11, 20 to 24, woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida, for if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented long ago in sackcloth and ashes. But I tell you, it will be more bearable for Tyre and Sidon on the day of judgment than for you. And you, Capernaum, will you be lifted to the heavens? No, you will go down to Hades. For if the miracles that were performed in you had been performed in Sodom, it would have remained to this day. But I tell you that it will be more bearable for Sodom on the day of judgment than for you. Jesus also says in John 15, 22 to 24, concerning the Jewish leaders, that if he had not come and done the works among them which no one else did, then they would not be guilty of sin. But as it is, they are guilty of sin. In John 18:36, Jesus is speaking to Pontius Pilate and says, my kingdom is not of this world. If it were of this world, my servants would fight to prevent me from being handed over to the Jewish leaders. in 1 Corinthians 2:8, Paul says concerning the event surrounding Jesus' crucifixion, that none of the rulers of this age understood this, the this being who Jesus is and who exactly, or what exactly Jesus was doing. For if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory. 1 Samuel 23:9-13 gives David in the city of Keilah, and he's hiding out because Saul wants to kill him. And he asks God, if I stay here, is Saul going to come and get me? And God says, yeah, if you stay here, Saul's going to come and get you. And David then says, well, if I stay here, will the men and women of the city turn me over to Saul? And God says, yep, they'll turn you over to Saul. At which case, David gets the heck out of town. And interestingly, when Saul hears that David is no longer at Keilah, he then gives up that expedition. In Jeremiah 38:17-18, Jeremiah is speaking to King Zedekiah and says, if you surrender to the Babylonians, you and your family will live. If you do not surrender to the Babylonians, then you and your family will die. So in light of the fact that human beings do have libertarian freedom, then those counterfactual statements have to be counterfactuals of indeterminacy. And I'm saying that because I think later on we'll probably get to a key difference, which is not oftentimes made, between counterfactuals of indeterminacy and counterfactuals of determinism. Next, I would also say it makes sense of texts concerning God's prevenient grace. In Titus 2:11, Paul says, for the grace of God has appeared that offers salvation to all people. So when people tell me prevenient grace is unbiblical, that's the first passage that comes to my mind. And I say, well, there's a grace of God here that offers salvation to all people. That's true. That's sort of a definition of prevenient grace, it seems to me. Or Romans 5:15-18, where Paul, it's very clear, is not a universalist. But he says, for if many died by the trespass of the one man, how much more did God's grace and the gift that came by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, overflow to the many? So the question is, what kind of grace are we dealing with here? Consequently, just as one trespass resulted in condemnation for all people, so also one righteous act resulted in justification and life for all people. Now, if you're a universalist, you're going to say that means that by virtue of God's grace, everybody is saved. But if you're not a universalist, this would mean the grace that makes possible justification and life is given to all people, which is prevenient grace. And then Jesus says in John 12:32, and I, when I am lifted up from the earth, will draw all people to myself. It's not just some that he's going to draw. So I would say, in making sense of passages on libertarian free will, on counterfactual truths that God knows, on prevenient grace, as well as a host of other truths, such as God's sovereignty, God's universal salvific will, that Molinism really provides sort of the puzzle to which these various non-contradictory puzzle pieces belong. The Bible is not a text on systematic theology, nor is it a text on philosophy of religion. What it tells us is true, but it doesn't always fit together these various truths. And sometimes when people try to ram the puzzle pieces together in ways hostile to the puzzle pieces themselves, they make those puzzle pieces deformed. And I would submit that's what happens in both, well, in Calvinism, Arminianism, and in open theism. Whereas Molinism provides you sort of a rubric in which you can say, yeah, I see where all of these puzzle pieces fit. They may not interconnect with each other, but they all do fit within a larger framework. So that would be my biblical reason for thinking that Molinism is true. My philosophical reason is just asking the question of counterfactuals of indeterminacy Again, counterfactuals of indeterminacy would be counterfactuals like if this individual creaturely essence with libertarian freedom, so I'm going to call that a CLE, if CLE were in fully defined set of circumstances C, then the CLE or the instantiation of the CLE would do action A or would not do action A. It seems to me that one can show relatively easily that, logically speaking, prior to any decision by God, that one of those two statements is true. So one might say that at this point, well, you're just misusing the principle or the law of conditional excluded middle. Now, conditional excluded middle, it is true, does not apply to every pair of counterfactuals. So let's take generic counterfactual, if such and such were the case, then such and such would be the case, versus if such and such were the case, then such and such would not be the case. The law of excluded middle does not apply to every set of counterfactuals like that. In other words, philosophers can come up with examples of counterfactuals where the antecedent, the if clause, has no relation whatsoever to the then clause, such as if Luis de Molina was picking his nose on October the 11th, 1588, then Kirk MacGregor would pick his nose on October the 11th, 2008. Well, it's not going to work with that versus if Luis de Molina was picking his nose on such and such a date, then I would be picking my nose on such and such a date. But it does work when you've got counterfactuals where you have to have one true and the other false, and that one is true is guaranteed. So using the semantics, the Stelnacker-Lewis semantics, the traditional semantics for understanding counterfactuals, the statements about the CLEs that I made, that the instantiation would do A or would not do A, those are logical contraries. And that means if one is true, then the other is false. And by virtue of the fact that the circumstances are fully specified, then one of them has to be true, because in those circumstances, the agent has to do A or not A. There isn't any other option available. And so by virtue of that, these counterfactuals of indeterminacy must be true logically prior to any decision that God makes. And I'm persuaded that if God is omniscient, then God needs to know those truths. And one reason why I am not a Calvinist is because Calvinism says that God does not know these truths. And that's astonishing. It says these truths exist, but yet God doesn't know them. And the way a Calvinist might try to explain that is they say, well, I don't believe that those have a truth value yet, but I've just given an argument that they do. And until someone can refute that argument, as far as I'm concerned, they do. So when the Calvinist says that, or the open theist says that, and even to some degree the Arminian might believe that, if the Arminian holds to a B theory of time or a tenseless theory of time. But the Molinist really is able to say, no, God is so intelligent, God is so insightful, God has such intuition that God knows for any possible creaturely essence, and a creaturely essence would just be an idea of what creatures God could make. And these, of course, are eternally generated by God's imagination. That God is smart enough to know by looking at each one of them, if he were to create them, what they would do. And God knows this with certainty. And since there is a truth value to these, and God is omniscient, then they are logically knowable to God. And Molinism holds that God knows such truths. And I think that's my main philosophical reason for thinking that Molinism is true. It's simply inconceivable to me that God can be omniscient and yet not know counterfactuals of indeterminacy prior to God's creating the world.
Okay. So I see what you're saying there. I'm glad that you brought scripture as well as the philosophical, because the next portion I want to kind of talk about is we sometimes Molinists get accused of not deriving Molinism from scripture, but instead getting it from philosophy. And Molina himself, it was about the scripture to him, right? Molina didn't seem to want to do this to come up with some new philosophical system. Molina, it seemed to me from the content I've seen and read from you, is that Molina had all these verses and he was trying to make sense of
Correct.
how they cohered.
Correct.
So,
Correct.
Yeah.
And then using philosophy and bringing that to bear. So I'm a firm believer, and Molina would have been as well, that all truth is God's truth. That we don't pit various streams of truth against each other. That to me seems ridiculous. Rather, I tend to think that having a good knowledge of philosophy is really imperative to having a really good knowledge of theology to be able to make sense of the Bible. So I'm a big believer in what the scholastics held in the Middle Ages, that, you know, philosophy should be taught first and then theology should be taught second, because without that philosophical background, how can you study the highest possible science, theology, the knowledge of God, if you don't even have the lesser sciences like philosophy down pat first?
Right.
That would be like somebody trying to go into calculus without ever taking algebra or trigonometry. So yeah, you're quite correct that Molina saw these various biblical texts. He did not think that all of them were being dealt with appropriately by the Protestant reformers. That's not true of all of them, but Luther and Calvin. And that therefore, he said, we've got these texts. We can't say that, well, let's use this type of text to say, well, the other text really doesn't mean what it looks like it means. For example, texts on God's universal salvific will. To say, well, they don't really mean all people or the whole world. They mean all kinds of people, or people from every nation and tribe and race or whatever. And Molina would say, no, you can't do that. You've got to let scripture stand on its own merits. And that's something that I've appreciated about Molinism from the very start, that I don't have to pit scripture against scripture, that I can believe in the totality of what scripture says. And then using the tools of philosophy, I think of philosophy as the handmaiden to theology, then you can begin to make sense of this. So there's nothing wrong with starting with scripture to see what the issue is, and then bringing the resources of philosophy to bear upon it. I think that that's quite glorifying to God and part of what Jesus meant when he told us to love God with all of our minds.
Yeah, so that's very interesting that you mentioned that, because I had actually, and when I'm looking down, I'm just taking notes, I had actually written down when you said offers salvation to all people, I was actually going to say, yeah, but you know, Kurt, that all just means like all kinds, right? Just the kind of joke, you know, but we often hear that, but it can't work out in the Greek that way, right?
No,
but it
can't.
But the only thing, so I think that the people that I've heard, they say, okay, it can't work out in the Greek, but from what we know of Paul's other writings, we can infer that that's what he's talking about here as well. And so I don't know, that for me, I don't know if you can stretch it that far, but
yeah. Well, and what I would say is only if you interpret Paul's other writings with the presupposition that God determines everything. And of course, that's the crucial presupposition. Does God determine everything?
Yeah, and then it's like, are you going to use that same hermeneutic when it comes to other terms, that other people with a different view want to say, well, Paul used it differently over here, right? And so I'm just wondering if, you're going to have to try and be consistent there.
Right, right.
And as far as you're talking about philosophy coming before theology would be very helpful to a student or somebody that's studying the word. And I at first, somebody might try and take you out of context by saying, look, he's saying philosophy is more important, but that's not what you're saying. Rather, what you're saying is something like, for me, so I think about this. I had a talk with Dr. Ben Arbour. I had him on my show, and he talked about Oliver Chris, his doctoral advisor, and he said that he's more of a philosophical theologian with the emphasis on the theologian part. I'm more of a theological philosopher, right? And for me, I guess how I'm looking at this is what you're saying is, I know the quadratic equation by heart, and it's like this long. I can say the whole thing because I was taught it in like a 10th or 11th grade, because I had to know it. I had to memorize it in order to pass.
Yes.
And so our teacher taught it to us in a tune. So now I can recite it by tune.
Yes.
And later on, I taught myself like the Hebrew alphabet by a different tune, right? So I'm like, oh, that's a good way to, do it. But I don't know how to use it at all.
Right, right.
And so I might know a theological thing like, oh, yeah, well, I believe in this. But then when I get challenged on it, like, well, how can that work with this? It's like, oh, well, listen, I'll talk to my pastor, and I'll see what he says. But if you had that background, it would seem that you could work your way through these things.
Yes.
Without having to appeal to somebody else that I'll talk to or whatever. Is that kind of what you're getting at?
That's exactly what I'm getting at. Yes. So I'm definitely not saying that philosophy is greater than theology. I'm saying quite the opposite. That would be like saying that, algebra is more advanced mathematically than calculus, which is false. I'm saying that in order to study the greatest possible science, theology, then one needs to have mastered the lesser sciences that are prerequisite to it.
It helps to go in order. Right. Yes. It helps to be in order. And that just makes so much sense to me. But I wanted to say that because I can just see people taking a clip of you going, I think philosophy should come first or whatever, and then going, see, Molinism is about philosophy. It's not about scripture. So anyway, with that being said, I want to play a clip real quick of some of these exact criticisms. That way, people don't watch this and go, who are they attacking? They're just attacking straw man up there. Let's take a look at this, and this will kind of get us more into some of the critiques, and it'll help us develop our terms more as well. So let me pull this up real quick, and and I'll let you respond to this as well.
Now, all of this is, again, this amazingly vain attempt to try to rescue libertarian free will. And I think it's a failed attempt, but it's certainly a popular attempt simply because of the names of the people that are promoting it. It's outside of God's control. What's the simpler way of saying what he's saying right now? Of the cards he's been dealt. Those counterfactuals, truth value of those counterfactuals, those hypotheticals, God didn't have anything to do with it. He's just doing the best he can. Doing the best he can with cards he's been dealt. That's what you're hearing right there. Same thing. Hasn't changed. I've said many times, Molinism is a man-made philosophy pretending to exist in biblical theology. God did the best he could. Given the cards he was dealt, he didn't use that terminology here, but that's what he's saying. It's not feasible. How is that not exactly what he said earlier about the card dealer? The circumstances available to God, in answering a question about evil as a Molinist, says, well, look, God's got to play with the cards he's been dealt by middle knowledge. To which I go, then we need to be worshiping the card dealer because the card dealer is superior to God, because the card dealer sovereignly determined what free creatures would do in any given circumstance. Either that, you have to say, well, nobody did that, which means now the very form of any possible world is determined by some it's fate. It's just fate. Determine these things. This is the grounding objection. It's been the objection. Francis Turretin made this the essence of his argument in his Institutes of Eclectic Theology. And I believe it's an absolutely valid, unquestionable fatality to the Molinistic.
Okay, so we heard a little bit there, and
Yes, many different things there.
yeah, we heard a few things there, right? But one is that Molinism is this vain attempt to try and let me just say ahead of time, right? Like, I'm going to play a few different people because I got 2 more clips, and the other ones are much shorter. But a lot of these people are people that I actually really like, and I've followed their work for years, and I think, hey, great apologists, got some great material, a few of these different people, right? So I don't want to say that any of these people are like, oh, they're beyond being saved or anything like that, right? I just want to say that, like, let's take their critiques, and we hear that Molinism is kind of a vain attempt to preserve libertarian free will first. What do you say about that?
I would say no. Whether or not libertarian freedom is possible is a matter of God's omnipotence. It's simply a question, does God have the power to create creatures who possess libertarian freedom? And I believe, as an omnipotent being, that God does have that power. Omnipotence means the ability to do anything that is logically possible. It is logically possible for creatures to have libertarian free will. There's no logical contradiction in it. Then God, by definition, is able to do it. So libertarian freedom is possible regardless of Molinism. For goodness sake, Arminians believe in libertarian freedom. Open theists believe in libertarian freedom. Some atheists probably believe in libertarian freedom, although they might have a hard time explaining it or justifying it based on materialism, if they happen to be materialists. But Molinism isn't an attempt to save libertarian free will. Molinism tries to show how God can be omniscient, and really tries to defend God's full omniscience by saying, look, we've got a God who knows counterfactuals of indeterminacy. So libertarian freedom is possible regardless of Molinism. He then said, if I remember correctly,
God has no
that
hand in it.
like the decision that a person would do in such and such a situation, who made the decision what Sam would do? And I would say it depends on the situation. It depends on what kind of counterfactual that you're dealing with. And Dr. White seems to just view this through the lenses of Calvinism and not realize that he's confusing 2 distinct types of counterfactuals. He's confusing counterfactuals of determinism, whose truth values God determines, and there are counterfactuals of determinism. So the counterfactual that if God were to create such and such a world, he would send Christ in that world. That's a counterfactual of determinism. God determines that. God determines the truth value. But that confuses it with counterfactuals of indeterminacy, whose truth values no one determines by definition because they're indeterminate. So God doesn't determine counterfactuals of indeterminacy even on Calvinism. So rather, it's that God, though allegedly omniscient, lacks knowledge of these counterfactuals of indeterminacy. And I would argue even feels that his sovereignty is threatened by them. And therefore, on Calvinism, God chooses to create a feasible world containing only counterfactuals of determinism. If Dr. White were reading Matthew 11:21, he would read it very differently than I would. He would think that when Jesus said, woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Bethsaida, for if the miracles performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, they would have repented in sackcloth and ashes. He thinks that expresses the statement, if the miracles were performed in you had been performed in Tyre and Sidon, and I determine their response, they would have repented in sackcloth and ashes. Well, that's not the counterfactual that I'm thinking that statement expresses. But if that's the kind of world God has chosen to create, then I would agree with Dr. White that God clearly determines its truth value. However, I think an omniscient God has chosen to create a world containing counterfactuals of indeterminacy. So I think Jesus is instead expressing the statement, if the miracles were performed in you had been done in Tyre and Sidon, and I did not determine their response, they would have repented in sackcloth and ashes.
Right.
This statement has a truth value, and Dr. White believes God does not know it. And he tries to justify God's not knowing it based on the grounding objection. Now, as I've already explained, I think that I've made an argument that the grounding objection does not stand, because
Right.
these counterfactuals of indeterminacy are logical contraries, and one of the other of them have to be true because the circumstances are fully specified. So it's amazing to me that Dr. White, while really claiming, oh, I'm just going on scripture, he raises the grounding objection, which is purely out of philosophy.
Just philosophy, right?
That's not out of scripture. How can you justify the grounding objection by virtue of scripture? Is he really going to say that God is bound to what the grounding objection will permit God to know?
Yeah, I found that to be interesting because I'm going to play another clip in a minute that really he's only got like one segment in, but it's got a lot of other people. They're kind of, and I want to take a little bit of time on the grounding objection by itself here in a minute. So let's not get into all the explanations so far.
Okay.
But I did find it interesting that in one setting he says, this is just, it's not from scripture, it's not exegetical, it's philosophy. And then his argument against it was the philosophical grounding objection.
Yes.
And so I understand what you're saying, and I think that's right, that even if the grounding objection worked as a philosophical argument, that which we don't grant, we're not going to concede that.
Right.
But let's just say if it were the case that we can't justify or show that God, could possibly have this this knowledge of creatures, free creatures, it still wouldn't follow that the scripture teaches that. The scripture doesn't say anything about that.
Right.
So, and is there anything you wanted to say about that before we move on to the next one?
Well, I do want to get back to the grounding objection, but let's go to the next one first.
Okay, yeah, because these are going to because I hate to go to the grounding objection and then I play the next two like short clips, and then they say something about it. Yeah, so anyway, let's go to this next one here.
I don't believe that God could have middle knowledge of exactly what I would order, because I did change it. As predictable as I am, and some of you aren't anywhere near as predictable as I am. So I question this first assertion. I don't believe that middle knowledge is found, because I think it really destroys what they're trying to preserve, and that is some concept of the autonomous will of man. Second,
you guys are talking about the libertarian free will, and this is important because a lot of people seem, not saying they do, but a lot of people seem to go to Molinism because of a belief in libertarian free will, almost to a fault.
Because I think what Andrew said before is some people tend to lean towards Molinism because it answers a theological and philosophical question, as opposed to deriving Molinism exegetically.
All right, so we had just a couple comments there about middle knowledge, and they were being a little more polite, of course. Eli, you've been on his show, and he is a very, very polite guy. And as well, I was asking him questions on a friend of mine's show the other night about Molinism, and he was just like, hey, I think that we need to have this like conversation, in a more brotherly type way, and I think that he has a great approach to it because he's been a Molinist. And if you wanted to respond to that, or did you want me to play the last little clip before you respond?
Well, I would say that it seems to me that Calvinism and Arminianism and open theism are every bit as much as philosophical as Molinism. You can't derive Calvinism plainly by the scriptures. You've got to impose the philosophical assertion of determinism upon scripture in order to do that. You can't get Arminianism plainly from the scriptures. You've got to import the B theory of time onto the scriptures to do that. You can't get open theism directly from the scriptures. You've got to import the grounding objection onto that. and the fact and the idea that the grounding objection even trumps how various passages on exhaustive defined foreknowledge are to be read. So I think that's just I think that's a very poor excuse. I know they don't mean it as an excuse, but I think it's a very poor excuse because all of these views have deep philosophical roots if one studies them. And I think one is just kidding oneself if one tries to deny that.
Yeah. So let's play this last clip, and then we'll get into the grounding objection, because that's going to be our main thing to talk about really here. So
I think that Molinism is more determinist than Calvinism would be, because once God chooses that world, you can't do anything but what he chose.
I hold to the notion of middle knowledge, but I don't call it middle knowledge. I'm comfortable with subsuming that under natural knowledge.
Stand Molinism. It's not because I don't think God has middle knowledge, but because I think if God uses middle knowledge to guide his providence, then the problem of evil is terrible, because God gets exactly the world he wanted. Exactly the world he wanted. It says of this world that it gives you a meticulous providence view. And if you think this world is exactly what God wanted.
Okay, so let me try and keep these in order for you, right? Right before this clip, yeah, it seems like a lot, but I didn't want to just put it all on like the Arminians or all on the open theist or something like that, or the Calvinists. So I wanted to make sure I had, enough to go around of everybody. So the first thing that we seen on the previous video was that White says, and I don't think God could have this knowledge of what I would do, because as predictable as I am, I choose different sometimes. I think, isn't that just kind of a misunderstanding of what we mean? Right? Because,
well, it really is exactly what I was accusing White of before. Here, he just flatly admits that there is knowledge out there and it has a truth value. Logically, it has to have a truth value before God's creative decree. Somehow, on his view, God is omniscient, and yet God doesn't know it. And to me, that is just incredible. I don't know how he can consistently hold that God is omniscient on that view.
Yeah, that's so interesting that we get accused from a lot of these people of, you're limiting God. But then they'll turn around and say,
not at all.
I don't think God could know what we could do, would do.
Exactly.
And I'm like, we're limiting God, but you don't think that he could possibly know what we would do if he's the one that created us. And we'll get into that. The next one was, or did you want to say anything about that before we move on?
No, that's
okay.
I think that's it.
Okay. And then the next one was Andrew Rappaport said something like, I think that Molinism is more deterministic than God, because whenever he puts you, because whenever you're there, you can't do other than what he says, or what he created, what he made. You have to do it. And I feel like no, you could have done otherwise, but you wouldn't have.
Right. So how Molinism is more deterministic than Calvinism, that makes no sense. I think Rappaport may be confusing the use in philosophical literature of divine creative decree with divine creative decision, where divine creative decision doesn't give the misleading consequence that, once God has chosen which world to create, then you have to do what God knows. No, absolutely not. You don't have to do what God knows. You will, but there's no logical necessity, because knowledge is not causally determinative, no matter who holds it.
Right.
Think about what knowledge is. Knowledge is an abstract object. It doesn't cause anything. So to illustrate the point, I know with certainty, human beings have a little bit of middle knowledge. I know with certainty, I know my wife so well that I know that if I were to take her to Olive Garden and the options before her were for drinks were Diet Dr. Pepper and Pepsi, I know with certainty that in those circumstances, she would choose the Diet Dr. Pepper. Now, suppose that I kind of do what God did. I decide to bring those circumstances into being. I decide that I'm going to take her to Olive Garden, and I call ahead and I sort of rig things to make sure that those are the only two things that the server is going to suggest to her. Then I know by virtue of that what she will do. But does my knowledge have any deterministic power? Does it exert some type of magical influence over her? So when the server asks her, what do you want to drink? It makes her lips move and it forces her to say, Diet Dr. Pepper. Of course not. She orders the Diet Dr. Pepper just as freely as if I had no foreknowledge or middle knowledge at all. And Molina insists that the same is true with God.
Yeah, because the knowledge of what she would do, it doesn't stand in a causal relationship to what she's gonna do, right?
That's exactly right.
It's like I said earlier on the case where I know not only that my wife doesn't prefer mint chocolate ice cream, she actually hates it. Like it's like brushing your teeth and drinking orange juice to her or something like that. It's just they shouldn't go together. Right. So the fact that I know that she's not going to choose that given chocolate or mint chocolate, it says nothing about it says nothing about the relationship between my knowledge of having that and then causing it to occur. So yeah, I 100% agree with you on that.
Right.
And so, and I have to say that Rappaport is actually in that discussion he was having. He was actually very genuine and like I think he was kind of spitballing a little bit, but he actually said things like, "Hey, listen, you guys that are taking Molinism at first glance and thinking," he goes, "I'm serious. Take a look at it a little deeper because there is more to this. That's why people are actually looking into it." So I want to give him credit, of course, for that. I don't want to put it out like you don't know what you're talking about. He probably just hasn't read quite as much. So the next quote that we had was Greg Kokel, and he said that something like, I adhere to middle knowledge, but I'm not a Molinist, and I think that middle knowledge is just subsumed in God's natural knowledge. What do you think about this?
I think he's making a confusion here. Kukul seems to be confusing statements whose truth values are logically necessary, namely necessary truths, and statements that logically necessarily have a truth value, but it is not logically necessary which truth value they have. Those would be contingent truths. And so in God's natural knowledge, God does know all necessary truths, that is, all statements whose truth values are logically necessary. But counterfactuals of indeterminacy, it is logically necessary that they have a truth value. I've argued that already today, but it's not logically necessary which truth value they have. And so that would need to, in the explanatory order of things, come after God's knowledge of those things that are logically necessary. It's obvious that if God didn't, logically speaking, know what could be, God couldn't know what would be. God couldn't say, well, I know what would be, but I have no idea what could be.
Right.
It's getting things turned around.
I know my wife would choose mint chocolate over chocolate, but I don't know if she could do it.
Yeah, exactly.
No, you have to know first that she could do it before you know that she would in fact do it, right?
Yeah.
Kind of, okay. Let's see, was there any others on that before we get into the grounding objection? Trent Doherty. He says that he says that it's not that I don't think God has middle knowledge. So I made this clip because we have, I don't think God has middle knowledge, I think God has middle knowledge, but it's subsumed in his natural knowledge. And then finally Doherty saying, I think God has middle knowledge, but that if he uses it, then in the clip, he said something like, if he uses it, then he gets exactly what he wants, a meticulous providence world. And so this is the world God would want. And if you think this is the world God would actually want, then, right? But then one more thing here is he also says later on that I didn't have enough time to put together more, but something like, and if God, I think God can have it, but if he uses it, then he's responsible. And so I want to kind of get into first the why we believe that this could be the world that God would want, because you might say in God's perfect world, right, without free creatures, then God wouldn't have evil and all these other things, right? But in God's, I believe Molina called it the not contingent reality, but the do you remember? Sorry, give me 1 second. I'll tell you exactly what I'm thinking of.
Okay.
Molina. Sorry. Oh, he differentiates between God's absolute will and God's conditional will. I was thinking contingent will, but conditional. So, yeah, if God had his way absolutely and free creatures were perfect like he is and they were God, then maybe his world would be exactly, you know, as it was with him just being in heaven or whatever, right? Like you could just say the Trinity sitting there, right? 3 persons that had a perfect world without, you know, whatever.
Yeah.
I think he's confusing that what God would want with the God's conditional will that Molina distinguishes, the world that would be the best world that he could use as free creatures to bring by his goals.
Yeah. I think that it is not the case that, according to Molinism, that God gets exactly the world that God would most want, because I agree, the world that God would most want is a world in which nobody ever sins, that there are no natural disasters, that there's no suffering, that there's no pain, and so on. The question is, does God know in his middle knowledge that if he were to create creatures with libertarian freedom, that they would choose to go along with this? And if God knows that they would not, then it's logically impossible for God to create a world in which they do have libertarian freedom, and yet they still do exactly what God wills 100% of the time. And I could say more about this later in talking about the problem of evil, but I've written elsewhere on the coexistence of God with evil and suffering. And I think it's logically impossible to have a world of genuinely free creatures containing no moral or natural evil. I think of moral and natural evil is the logical price God has to pay for the overriding good of a world of genuinely free creatures. Now, of course, God could just determine that there would be a perfect world, but the question is, what exactly does one mean by perfection? If you determined all things, arguably you couldn't have such a thing as love, because if love depends on a libertarian free choice, then love of God is precluded. You couldn't have moral responsibility, because I think that depends on a libertarian free choice. So true moral responsibility is precluded. So you lose a lot in that kind of a world. And God could have created that kind of a world if God wanted to. I believe that, the Molinist can say to the Calvinist, look, I agree with you that if God saw that it was better to create the kind of world that you want, God would have created it. And that God would have just said, well, I don't know counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. They threaten my sovereignty, so I'm not going to touch them with a 10-foot pole. I'm just going to have counterfactuals of determinacy, where I determine everything, and I even determine what non-existent creatures would do in such and such other circumstances. Just determine everything in my decree. And God could have done that if he wanted to. It's just that I think, based on scripture, that God didn't do that.
Right. Yeah, so that's a good point, that you're like, hey, we're going by what scripture says, right? Yeah, sure, God could have not, but based on scripture, it seems like, that's the case. One thing I do want to say real quick is that I want to talk about analogies real quick before we move on, because you said if God creates free creatures, that's the price he has to pay. And I can already see the other Calvinists and other people saying, you see, God has to pay a price, It's the same thing from the first clip where we keep hearing repeatedly.
You can take, it's very easy to take things out of context. I think that this card dealer analogy, which came about by an analogy that Craig was trying to use, has been brazenly taken out of context by Dr. White and by others. And of course, you can take anything anyone says out of context, but that's disingenuous. You have to go by what they actually mean.
Right. And that's what I was just about to say, is that, in fact, Dr. White says, Greg, he just wants to have his cake and eat it too. I could just say, well, who would want cake if they couldn't eat it? The point of the analogy wasn't that you should have cake and not eat it.
Exactly.
The point of the analogy is that you're trying to have, like, you want to have a wife and a girlfriend on the side, that kind of thing.
Right. Yeah.
And there used to be a business coach that I used to listen to a while back, and he used to make that that leap in logic where, people would say, like, oh man, you want to have your cake and eat it too. And he'd go, why would I have cake if I didn't want to eat it? And the point with the cards he was dealt analogy isn't that, oh, God just, since it was that way, God had to do it. No, God could have not created free creatures. He could have created a world full of perfect robot creatures that did exactly what he wanted to and bow down to him. But the point is that God wanted truly free creatures to, and in that type of world, it logically entails that God can't manipulate them into doing exactly what he wants, because of what freedom means, right?
Right.
So it's taking what's meant by, and I've noticed this in almost every discussion I've had and give analogies. It's always the analogy. It's never the point of the analogy. I used to talk about in ethics. I used to say something like, well, think about deontology. Think about the rules on a chessboard. You do blah, blah, blah. And then they would want to quibble about, they go, oh yeah, but there was a new rule in chess that was invented, blah, blah, blah. So I started using tic-tac-toe because it's mathematically the way that it's going to be on the board, right? And so I started using that example because instead of actually getting to the issues, we sit there and argue about the examples, and I got to find a new example. So yeah, I thought that when you said that, I was like, okay, we got to go over this real quick just for the people listening, because somebody will pull this out of context. So anyway, all right. So let's move toward the grounding objection first, I guess. I love the way that you handle the grounding objection because, before really reading much of your work, I had heard a few explanations from Molinists, but you really have this like comprehensive, like what you call a highway of answers, which is like you can get off here. First, the first stop is what you said earlier, that, well, first of all, this isn't even a biblical argument. It's a philosophical argument, right? And the second stop is something like, even if we don't know how it works, that doesn't mean that we can't still believe it, right?
Right.
And so why don't you go from there? Tell us, let's move down the stops real quick.
Yeah. Well, first thing I would say is that oftentimes people use the phrase grounding objection, and what they mean by it is, I don't understand how God could know such and such. That's not the way the grounding objection is used in philosophical literature. Grounding objection there means that there does not exist anything in reality by virtue of which some proposition is true. So a grounding objector would say that because there's sort of nothing there before God to be known, they would think that there's nothing there before God to be known, and that's how they would try to remedy God's omniscience by saying God just knows what's logically knowable, and it's not logically knowable. So the grounding objector is saying that counterfactuals of creaturely freedom are logically unknowable. So how would I try to diffuse the grounding objection? Well, there are several exits that you can take. First of all, the grounding objection presupposes a particular version of the correspondence theory of truth, known as Truthmaker Theory. Truthmaker Theory is only advocated by a minority of philosophers. So, as I said before, the grounding objection alleges that there is no metaphysical ground, aka the truth maker, on which any proposition about a contingent choice can be true logically prior to its occurrence. So, concerning propositions about contingent choices logically prior to their occurrence, these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom, the grounding objector William Hasker has asked, who or what is it, if anything, that brings it about that these propositions are true? So that's his way of stating the grounding objection. But I would ask, which is more obvious, Truthmaker Theory or the truth of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom? Plantingo, I think, is quite right when he says it seems to him much clearer that some counterfactuals of freedom are at least possibly true than that Truthmaker Theory is valid. So Molinists assert that even human beings with their finite intelligence and insight can foreknow some contingent choices of other human beings. So if I can foreknow some contingent choices, why can't God, with his infinite intelligence and insight, foreknow all contingent choices of possible individuals? Second way you can get off the highway, the grounding objection not only presupposes Truthmaker Theory, but it assumes an extreme version of this theory known as Truthmaker Maximalism. Truthmaker Maximalism says that every truth must have a truthmaker. Now, interestingly, most truthmaker theorists hold that only some truths need truthmakers, and they exempt propositions like counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. So you could say, well, why be a truthmaker maximalist? And if you don't find truthmaker maximalism valid, or if you exempt counterfactuals of creaturely freedom from needing a truthmaker, grounding objection doesn't hold. Third, the grounding objection requires that truthmakers be concrete objects that cause things to be true. But truthmaker theory in general, and even truthmaker maximalism, doesn't usually define a truthmaker in that way. So a truthmaker is, philosophically, it's defined as that in virtue of which a sentence or proposition is true. Now, when people say truth making, it's kind of deceptive because making sounds like a causal relation involving some concrete object. But normally, truth makers are not conceived like that by their advocates. Truth makers are usually construed to be things like facts or states of affairs, and those are abstract entities. More often than not, they're the facts stated as the truth conditions of a proposition, what's known as disquotation. So what makes the statement, quote, snow is white, true, is the fact that snow is white, or the state of affairs of snow's being white. And abstract entities, as we said before, don't stand in causal relationships. So I would say if counterfactuals of creaturely freedom require truth makers, why can't these truth makers be abstract objects? Namely, the facts revealed by the disquotation principle. Why can't go on.
No, I'm sorry. You finish your statement, and I want to stop there and kind of summarize before we move on.
Yeah. So why can't what makes the counterfactual of creaturely freedom, if I were rich, then I would buy a yellow Lamborghini, true, be the fact that if I were rich, then I would buy a yellow Lamborghini, or the state of affairs of my being rich and buying a yellow Lamborghini? I don't see why not. Yeah.
So
and then, yeah,
go ahead. I'm sorry.
And then I think the last thing that needs to be said is that someone could say, well, if there are these abstract objects out there, then these counterfactuals of creaturely freedom exist independently of God and so violate God's aseity. However, Molina was a divine conceptualist. I am as well. And Molina identified these abstract objects as among the contents of God's mind. So Molina proposed the doctrine of supercomprehension, and this would be God's unlimited intellectual capacity to perceive infinitely within God's own mind the individual essence for every possible thing he could create. And these individual essences don't exist independently of God. They don't exist outside of God. They only exist as designs within the mind of God. And then the ultimate ground of counterfactuals of creaturely freedom is God himself, is God's knowledge by virtue of God's intelligence, God's insight, God's intuition, God's beliefs about what these free creatures would do if he were to create them in such and such circumstances.
Okay, so let me just summarize all of that real quick before we move on to the next exit that we can get off, right? Because so what you're saying here, and just for myself and the audience, so we can put the scholarly into a more condensed version, because there's going to be some people who are, I guess, more they're newer. So what you're saying is that the Truthmaker, this grounding objection is based on a thing called the Truthmaker Theory.
Yes.
Right? And it's saying that
if Truthmaker Theory is false, then there is no grounding objection.
So first of all, you can just reject Truthmaker Theory as being the case, and there is reasons to be skeptical of it.
Most philosophers are.
Right. The second point is that even if you say Truthmaker Theory is the case, right? This is appropriate. The majority of people who accept it aren't even maximalist, meaning they don't think that everything needs a truth maker.
Correct.
Instead, the interesting thing is a lot of those things that they think don't need truth makers are counterfactual statements.
Yes.
So exactly what we're talking about here. And so that is very interesting. Then you're saying that and they try to say that these need to be concrete objects that cause something to be true. When the fact is that according to Plantingo in this disquotation principle, right? It's basically that what makes it true is the fact if you take away the quotation marks. So my wife would choose mint chocolate ice cream over chocolate if she were in an ice cream parlor with those two options. Now, if I take away the quotations and the fact that she would actually do that is what makes it true without some type of concrete object making it true.
Correct.
And then the last part of that is...
why I'll just jump in and say the making. That's why when people say truth making and makes it true, you have to give a little asterisk beside making, because making sounds like a causal relationship. And that's not the way any truth maker, maximalist or otherwise, understands truth makers. They just understand it as that in virtue of which something is true, but not as a causal relationship.
Right, like a justifier, but it doesn't have to necessarily be
correct
making it in that sense. Yeah.
Right,
and so the last part is abstract objects. And you're going to say that it doesn't need to be a concrete object. It can be an abstract object. And in fact, Molina himself had this. He was a divine conceptualist, which you are as well. And he basically says that amongst the the components. This is a component amongst God's in God's mind or something like that.
Yeah.
Would you say?
Yeah.
So these abstract objects that are the truth maker of this the case here are just abstract objects in the mind of God. And so that the whole point is that this is a bunch of ways off of the grounding objection highway.
Yes.
And so so are there more, or do we stop there?
I think we can stop there. I'm working on a few more that are going to come out in the book in 2023, but we'll stop there.
Sure, let's stop there. And I guess what we'll do is, are you pressed for time right now? How much do you think
I probably have about 15 more minutes.
Okay, so I guess what we can do is let's try and get through the. All right, give me 2 minutes. Explain the problem of evil. I'm just kidding. I do want to save like at least 5 minutes at the end for a couple of questions that I'm seeing in the chat. So let's just talk about the. We'll skip through some of the things that I have here because I got to get going as well after because I'm taking off today. I got a 4-hour drive. But let's talk about the problem of evil. And the first thing that we kind of skipped over a little bit before we get into the problem of natural evil and things like that is Doherty said that if God knows these things will occur and he uses that middle knowledge, then he's responsible. Uh-oh, we lost, it looks like we lost Dr. MacGregor here. Let's see. He must be having internet issues. You guys, today we're talking to Dr. Kirk MacGregor. This is really interesting. I see you in the chat. Yeah, we'll ask a couple of questions from the chat. I see you guys there. We're going to leave a few minutes to talk about it here at the end. Let's see. I think we got Dr. MacGregor back. Nope. Maybe not. It looks like his microphone came out, or his maybe his camera came out. Let's see what it says. Okay, yeah, it says that they need to connect their camera. So let me just message him in case he's a boomer like me. And sorry, let me fix this here. I hope you guys are having a great day. I've got to take off here in a minute and I got a long drive. Okay, looks like we got Dr. MacGregor back.
Yeah,
Hey,
my camera kicked me off. All right.
yeah, so that's what happens with me too as well whenever my camera comes out. So all right, so let's try and get through this real as quickly as possible. That way we can have some time at the end. So Doherty he basically insinuated that if God knew these things were going to occur and he used that knowledge to bring about this world, that he is in fact responsible for, let's say, a human deciding to do something evil or whatever, something like that. Let's talk about, because I think that what he's missing maybe is primary and secondary causation, or what's sometimes called like weak causation, right? So like you give an example about your class, but taking a quiz or something like that, right? But do you think that's what's going on here as well, or am I off base?
Well, I would say it's simpler than that. I think just because God chooses to create a world where he knows that bad things would happen contrary to his will, in no way implies that God causes those bad things. It may be the case that the bad things are logically unavoidable, given the conjunction of libertarian freedom and God's choice to create a world of libertarian free creatures.
Okay, I think I see what you're saying. Yeah. So, but there could even be another reason, like that God knows what world would bring about, let's say, free creatures. To be in heaven and not have the will or the want to sin at some point, but that he could do it freely, and he decides that would be a good thing or whatever, right?
Yeah. So let me kind of begin here by talking about something that seems unrelated, but I'm going to draw this together. So I'm going to talk about what perfection is. So to begin with, perfection is completeness or wholeness in each and every respect. And I would say perfection is an essential attribute of God that may only reside intrinsically in God as necessary being. Now, it could reside extrinsically in something else, but it can only reside intrinsically in God.
Sorry, what was the term you used?
That
resides in God?
That perfection is an essential attribute of God that may only reside intrinsically in God. So the only thing that can be intrinsically perfect, in other words, complete or whole in each and every respect, is God. By contrast, contingent being, things that can come into being or go out of being, depends on God for their existence. and therefore they lack intrinsic completeness and wholeness. In each and every respect, contingent being is finite and limited. So it's logically impossible for God to create anything that is intrinsically perfect. God could bring it about that it's extrinsically perfect, and I'll talk about that in a minute. So what is then evil? Evil is any lack, whether small or great, of the complete limitless fulfillment that equals perfection. So the only way a created entity can be perfect and so not exhibit evil is for it to be extrinsically perfect. In other words, God's got to bring that entity into his definitive presence, that is his immediate presence, and that will overwhelm the entity's existing limitation and automatically prevent the display of its defects. So to give an analogy, which I hope is not misused, the sun communicates its light-bearing properties to non-intrinsically light-bearing objects that reflect its light. On the Christian worldview, the new heaven and the new earth, the new creation, will come when Jesus returns in all his glory, transfiguring the old creation by bringing it into God's definitive presence and reinfusing our souls into our resurrected bodies. Since God will immediately reside in the new creation, God's definitive presence will override the universe's inherent defects and the inherent defects of our resurrected bodies. However, the loveliness and the majesty of the vision of God, the beatific vision, will infallibly prevent people from sinning. So if the universe started out in God's definitive presence, then no one could freely choose for or against God. No one could freely choose for or against righteousness. Love of God would be impossible. Love assumes a prior free choice for God. It seems that only after the redeemed have made free choices to love God could God then eternally seal them in their choices by bringing them into the new creation. So God can't get to the new creation with libertarian creatures without the old creation first. Now, in the old creation, the present creation, God must be at an epistemic distance from the universe to preserve human freedom. So I would say now God is what theologians call replatively present in the universe. In other words, God is present in the sense that God sustains in being and knows what is happening at every point in space-time. At Christ's first coming, he had to be veiled in flesh so as to enable people to choose for or against him. However, human freedom entails that sometimes people will choose evil, and that would explain moral evil. The fact that God is not definitively present in the universe also means that the universe's inherent defects and the inherent defects of our bodies will manifest themselves, giving rise to such natural evil as sickness, disease, death, hurricanes, tornadoes, etc. So we can use kind of the level that you were talking about before, what Molina calls God's absolute will and God's conditional will. You could also call that God's absolute will and God's permissive will. So God's absolute will includes all instances of good. God's permissive will includes the evil that God hates, but permits for a time to, and cannot logically prevent, if he wants to, bring about the optimal balance of libertarian creatures who are saved.
Okay, yeah, so that's interesting. You know, I'm wondering about. Are you sorry? Are you having a call?
Yeah, but I'll just ignore it.
Okay, no worries. All right, so I find that very interesting. I think that you say so. If on your view, the syllogism that goes, if pointless suffering, if pointless suffering exists, then God doesn't exist. Pointless suffering exists, therefore God doesn't exist. You're going to take the first of those premises and say that's incorrect, right?
I think the first premise is definitely incorrect.
Okay.
The first premise assumes two things. It assumes, first of all, that if God is all-powerful, then God can create any possible world, just the exact world going exactly the way God's absolute will desires, and that if God is all loving, then God prefers a world in which there is no suffering or evil as opposed to one in which there is. And I don't think that either of those assumptions is true.
Okay. Well, yeah. So I agree with that. I think I would probably object to the second as well, but I understand
that's
your point
fine.
on
One can object to
explaining
either
that.
one. Yeah. And
Right.
so I would say that I think the evidential problem of evil is doubly fallacious. I think you can successfully challenge both premises in it.
Okay, so there's obviously a lot more that I want to get to, and but I unfortunately I do have a 4-hour drive I got to get to, and your time. I want to respect your time. I know you need to get going. I did want to ask one question from the audience. Sorry, you guys, I can't get to all these questions, but one person in particular is like, "Hey, please ask my question. Please ask." So he's done such great work on this. So before we take off. If you could kind of briefly give a summary of your view on this. It says, Converse, if there is time, can you ask him to explain the 1 Corinthians 15 creed while it was written very early? It is truly amazing the work that Kirk has done on this creed. It's a little off topic, but it's still, she was so adamant about, please get to my question. Please get to my question. So if you don't mind, yeah.
Yes, he wants to know why it was formulated so early. Is that the question?
Yeah, they said that you did. She says that you did great work on the 1 Corinthians 15 creed and why it was written very early.
Yes. Well, we can know, first of all, that this is a creedal formula because it works out as a symmetrical parallel 6-line structure where you look at the first 3 lines and it's parallel to the next 3 lines. There's a dependent clause at the end of line 1 and 3. There's similarly dependent clause at the end of lines 4 and 6. You can look at several of the words that are used there by in the creed, and these are words that are used nowhere else by Paul in his writings. So if you're just looking at this linguistically, you would say Paul is not writing in his own hand. Paul is quoting something that he got from somewhere else. Also, Paul says in prefacing the creed and introducing it that I delivered to you as of first importance what I also received. He's saying, this is something that I didn't make up, but I was given this by someone else. And so the question is, well, how early is this? Well, we know from Paul's letter in Galatians chapter 1, which no scholar admits is an authentic letter of Paul, that Paul came to Jerusalem 3 years after his conversion. Paul's conversion was approximately in 32 CE, so he would have come to Jerusalem in 35, and it was there that he learned the Jesus traditions, including this one, from Peter, from James, and from John. So we know that this creed was in existence by 35, if not earlier. And there are many scholars who would say it can be traced much, much earlier than that. It can be traced to even within months of the events that are being described. And that's because of the Semitisms, in other words, the things that are obviously somebody thinking in Hebrew and putting it into Greek. For example, even the name of Peter in the creed, Cephas, that's used. That's a Semitism. The fourfold repetition of that, hatai, that's not normal to Greek grammar. That's a Semitism. So those are various reasons why we know that this has to go back at least as early as 35 CE.
Wow. Thanks so much for that, Dr. MacGregor, and thanks so much for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Oh, you're very welcome.
I really feel like scholars are just so charitable. I message a scholar and I'm like, hey, would you, be willing to come on? And they're like, well, yeah, I'll just be like, I'm sure you've got so much other things to do. But what I want you guys to do is I want you to go out and check out these 2 books, okay? Whether you agree or disagree, this book is going to be on Luis de Molina, his life and the philosophy and the debates that were going on during the Reformation era. This is a very interesting book. A lot of highlights in that book. This book, which I haven't quite finished yet, it has so many contributors in it. Calvinism and Middle Knowledge, where Kirk MacGregor's one of the contributors to the book, but it's just such a great book to have. And so these two are definitely ones you want to check out and put on your bookshelf. So with that being said, it's funny. I put them right on top of Calvin, a work by Calvin. So isn't that kind of funny? God knew that would happen. But anyway, thanks everybody for coming by. I'm sorry I didn't get to everybody's question. If this is your first time here, please hit the subscribe button. And if Kurt's willing to come back, I would love to have him back and answer some of these other questions. So, Kurt, thanks so much for being here.
You're very welcome.
I hope you have a great weekend. See you guys.